Welcome to Lynn Cullen Live. Talk radio without the static. Email your questions and comments to lynncullenshow@gmail.com. And now your host, Lynn Cullen.
Well, hello there and welcome to you. Oh boy. I guess I tend to start with the date, so let's do it. August 16th, 2023. And man, I got so many things I want to talk to you guys about. I think I'm going to start with some additions to some of the subjects we were talking about yesterday when Susan was on the show, because the New York Times has an obituary today for Joanne Meyer, who I don't think would have gotten the New York Times obituary normally, although she lived a wonderful and an important life. Never ventured far from the town she was born in, Marion, Kansas. Born there and died there, worked there, raised a family there. This is the 98-year-old woman who died the day after the local police raided her home, taking her computer, her phone. It turns out that her home is also where the offices, I guess, she lives where the offices of the newspaper are. This is this case that Susan and I were talking about, this outrageous violation of the First Amendment, where the crime committed is a crime of journalism. And journalism in a small town, population about 2,000, where Joanne Meyer and her son saved the local newspaper when the family that had owned it decided to sell it to what the kind of entity that small newspapers now end up selling to, a hedge fund that then just strips it, drains it of whatever assets it has, and kills it dead. They bought it instead and bought up 3 other little papers around: the Hillsborough Star-Journal, the Peabody Gazette Bulletin. They did all this in 1998 to save local journalism in these small Kansas towns. And her son, who is now the publisher, and had worked in journalism. He'd been at the Milwaukee Journal for years and then as a journalism professor. He says that the coroner has concluded that the stress of the police coming into her home uninvited, unannounced, was definitely a contributing factor, because she had been in relatively good health for a 98-year-old. I want to correct something I said. The newspaper's offices are not in the home. These were 2 separate locations. Her son has said that after the raid, she was just beside herself, really in a state of shock, and that she couldn't sleep. And he went up this just Saturday to wake her up and to bring her breakfast, which she had refused to eat her breakfast and went back to sleep, tried to sleep. He brought her breakfast up afternoon, and she was as close to a rant as you can do. She went out in mid-sentence ranting. And he says that she said, these are her son's words, she said over and over again, "Where are all the good people to put a stop to this?" He went on to say she felt like, how can you go through your entire life and then have something that you spent 50 years of your life doing just kind of trampled on, like it was meaningless. And he said she died in mid-sentence. She had continued to write a column for the paper up until last year, when her eyesight really made that very difficult. But she had been writing for the paper along with her husband for 50 years. And then they ended up buying it. She ended up buying it with her son to save it. That never would have been in. She would not have got an obit. But the cops killed her, essentially, and violated her First Amendment rights. And I wanted to start with that because there's another story in the news about another little town newspaper being harassed, I guess would be the right word, harassed into oblivion by people with a lot more money than a little small town newspaper has. And this paper is in northern Wisconsin, in a little town called Wausau. The Wausau, what is the name of this little paper? It's funny how these little papers always have like two, the Gazette. Why do they all have two names, as if one would never have sufficed? Like the ones that the Myers owned, the Hillsborough Star Journal and the Peabody Gazette Bulletin. You know what I'm going to bet? I'm going to bet that there had initially been two newspapers back in the day, and that the towns were unable to, support two, and so they would combine, and you'd end up with the Hillsborough Star Journal. In the case of Wausau, it's the Wausau Pilot and Review. And what is going on with this paper is a story in the business section of the New York Times today. And it started at a Wausau County Board meeting 2 years ago that got really heated, and heated in the way our politics are heated now. Heated by a subject on which people dig in and just go at each other. The subject being a resolution had been proposed intended to promote diversity and inclusion. It's just amazing how many people will literally fight to the end to prevent the horror of diversity and inclusion. And in this meeting, things got very hot. And the Wausau Pilot and Review, the paper, reported that during the meeting, a man, Corey Tomzik, called a 13-year-old boy who had also testified a fag. That man is now, since he called this 13-year-old boy a fag in this public meeting, he has, by virtue of, I guess, the celebrity he's achieved by going to the mat against diversity and inclusion, he has since become a Republican state senator from Wausau. He demanded an immediate retraction. And the pilot in review said, no, we're not retracting it. You said it. We're standing by the article. And plenty of people under oath have said, he said it. We all heard him say it. It's amazing how many people that were there, that were Republicans and against diversity and inclusion, somehow didn't hear him say it. Because our politics are so ludicrous now that they can literally strike people with intermittent deafness if something is being said that they don't want to acknowledge. So just in April, so for 2 years, this guy is going after this little paper. They have all of 4 employees. They have had to hire a lawyer to deal with all this stuff. And the financial burden of that is impacting the paper's ability to pay its employees. Do I pay the lawyer or do I pay my reporters? So just this April, a judge threw it out, saying that this SOB had not met the legal standard for proving that he had been defamed. Namely, he actually said it. At that point, in April, this little paper had already paid out $150,000 to fight this guy. And guess what he's now done? He's filed an appeal. And this little newspaper's founder and editor, a woman named Shireen Seward, says she really doesn't know how she can continue to pay these legal bills and also keep the paper open. And it turns out the reason this little thing is a story is that this is a new bully boy thugocracy tactic employed by their leader, Donald Trump. What publication hasn't he sued and never wins? Never wins. He just sues them and then he doesn't bother to pay his lawyers. And a lot of other Republicans have picked up on this as a means of harassment. And in fact, with small publications like these little and so important newspapers, they're doing it to take them out so that they can go about their nefarious, fascistic business without the public knowing. Remember that case in Mississippi where that Brett Favre, the despicable former Packer quarterback, is entangled in, where it turned out that the governor and other people in the state, along with Brett Favre, they gave him a ton of money that was intended for poor people. And actually, the news organization down there, and I'm not remembering the name, in Mississippi, that reported on this scandal, that got it out so that the people knew about it, they want a Pulitzer Prize. That doesn't matter. The Republican governor is suing it, of course, for defamation, because that's this new tactic. And so that's the case with this little newspaper we never heard of, the Pilot and Review. There is absolutely no evidence that it reported anything false, let alone that it did so with actual malice, which would have to be part of a guilty verdict. And it's incredible. The reality is, little papers like this can be harassed by the law and by deep-pocketed public officials who don't like the news that's being reported about them. They can be literally sued into oblivion, destroyed. And this SOB not only is suing them, but he's now got political power. He was the owner of a recycling business when he made the slur 2 years ago. And since then, he's grown in stature. He's somebody people know about. He's a MAGA thug. Awful people. The damage they're doing is just unbelievable. And since I'm in my home state of Wisconsin with Wausau, I came upon something. It occurred to me in all the reporting of the horror, the unbelievable horror of the Maui fire. We keep hearing that it is the worst death toll ever. It's in the last 100+ years, right? And when papers do that and then don't tell you, well, what was the one, at that demarcation point over 100 years ago that had a higher death toll? And I bet a lot of people, like when it comes to fires that we're aware of, that were huge national news because of the loss of death, I imagine a lot of people immediately come up with what? So it's another big fire, about that happened over 100 years ago. Well, yeah, that'd be the Chicago fire, right? That was 1871. Well, here's the thing. The Chicago fire wasn't even the worst fire that day in the United States. Nope, nowhere near it. I'm not sure what the loss of life in the Chicago fire was, but the fact is it was Chicago. It was a major city and had a lot of newspapers and, easily gotten to. And so that was the story that everybody talked about, that everybody knew, and that yielded all of these mythological, absurd stories that, as far as any of us ever knew, it was Mrs. O'Leary's cow, right, that caused the fire, which, of course, was not true either. Turns out, and I didn't know this, I guess because at some point I came upon it by virtue of being a Wisconsin native. There was a fire north of Chicago the same day that killed as many as 2,500 people, 2,500. And it was a fire that, according to accounts of the few survivors, was very much like the Maui fire. No place to go. came so fast, so furiously. The air itself was on fire, said what? You could not, there was no people who jumped into the nearest water, and there was Green Bay, the body of water, Green Bay. The city sits at the tip of it. They jumped into Green Bay. And many of those who jumped into the bay to survive did make it, but a lot did not because they died of hypothermia before they dared to get out. It's called the Peshtigo fire, and it is the worst conflagration, I think I got that right, in American history. The devastation, I mean, if you look at a map, I was just in Green Bay, and I went to a farm exactly where this fire was, in a little town called Suamico, which sits on the water, on the bay, and Suamico was destroyed. All the little place-named towns that were the towns I know were destroyed up one side of the bay, and amazingly up the other side of the bay. So if you think of Lake Michigan, I don't know how familiar you might be with it, but if you just look at your hand and hold your four fingers together, but put your thumb out, don't have your thumb next to it, it's that space between your thumb and index finger that is Green Bay. Forms a bay like a hand. And that's the finger of Lake Michigan. So this was caused by the same thing. It makes sense. Chicago's on Lake Michigan. Peshtigo on Lake Michigan. Suamico, Oconto, Shawano, all those beautiful little towns. They were destroyed. The death toll really is no one ever is going to know. The Washington Post has an article today saying it was 12 to 1,500. But if you go to Wikipedia, they say 15 to 2,500. And most scholars of these kinds of horrors say the death toll was believed to be higher than the Johnstown flood, a horror that people in Pennsylvania certainly learn about, like I learned about the Peshtigo fire. But it's weird that, yeah, that's the fire that destroyed so many more lives than Chicago, and yet nobody knows about it. I mean, very few people know about it. But the Post has a story about it here, and the headline, "In Maui, Echoes of the Deadliest U.S. Wildfire, the 1871 Peshtigo Blaze." Incredible. So, and while we're near the water, I'm just going from here to there. Diana Nyad, you know the name. She's the amazing swimmer who has, she swam across, I mean, what hasn't she swam across? Certainly the English Channel, right? But she also swam, I think, famously from Florida to Havana, which was, I don't know what the length is, but she said it took her 53 hours. Well, actually 52 hours and 54 minutes. Can you imagine? So she kept swimming for over 2 days and nights. I mean, that's really astonishing. Anyway, she did that 10 years ago. She was no spring chicken 10 years ago. And I have to say that, well, she says she could not do that swim today. And not because of her age. I mean, she could not do that swim today, not because of her age, but because of the temperature of the water. So just as these blazes we're talking about are the result of drought and, timber going, spark in a drought-stricken area with high winds. It's the same recipe. But you can't put your foot in the ocean off of Florida in some places. I mean, you can, but if you're doing it to get refreshed, forget about it. Because as we've heard, the temperatures of the water are at some points in triple digits. And she said, I could not make that swim in such hot water because the body heat I would generate from the effort of swimming for over 2 days straight would quickly lead to my body overheating, hyperthermia, and I would fail. I could not do it. It would be impossible. And realizing that, she's just appalled at what we're doing to the oceans. And she says the warmer water is also creating, the jellyfish are in heaven. That's about it for the marine life that's in heaven. The coral reefs are dying. Dead lobster, she says, at the bottom, and dead fish floating on top, and increase in jellyfish swarms that come with the warmer water. I wonder how, Ron DeSantis and the other Republicans in Florida think that all of this is going to impact the tourist industry. Because people don't go into Florida to go into the ocean to get hopped or to be stung by jellyfish. Diana Nyad writes, I am grief-stricken at what we humans have carelessly and greedily done to our home, our magnificent planet. Yep. Hey, hang on. Oh my God, I found out something so troubling today, reading that in Georgia, I was happy to hear that in Georgia, because they're really into transparency in the legal system, that if the trial is held in Georgia, it will most certainly be televised for all to see, as it should be. Which is why I guess Mark Meadows is already sued as one of the defendants, trying to get it pulled out of Georgia and into federal jurisdiction. And that's likely to go to the Supreme Court. apparently it has little merit. So we'll hope that enough justices of that court will agree, and it will remain in Atlanta. But the transparency in Georgia extends too far in one case, and that is that grand jurors are not anonymous. So the names of the grand jurors in the indictment against Trump and all these other co-defendants are in the indictment. Their names are flat out listed on page 9 of the indictment. 23 people. And my God, you're kidding me. In this day and age, you've got the jurors in the New York case being shielded because there's fear for them. The fear of intimidation. I mean, the jury was not named until after the indictment. They were named in the indictment. But that then allows, bad actors to retaliate. And in fact, there's already people in social media saying, it's time we do the doxing, one says. People need to be outside these people's houses. And whether or not that happens, I don't know, but you got to believe that all of these jurors aren't sleeping as well. Several apparently have already disabled their profiles on Facebook, on LinkedIn. They're trying to, protect themselves in that way. They turned off their phones. One juror did answer a call from a Washington Post reporter who was calling to ask them questions about this, and they just said no comment and hung up. So that is a concern. And it seems like a really bad idea in this MAGA-ized America to put those people's names who were asked, to do their civic duty and who did, to put them in jeopardy, which I suspect they are now in. And so that means, imagine the jury that will actually hear the case. That's the jury. And their names, so they're going to be since juror intimidation is one of the calling cards of Donald Trump and his ilk, that suggests to me that things could get pretty frightening because of this transparency in Georgia. Wow. Normally we think of transparency as something so wonderful, but in this case, I don't think so. Really don't think so. Ugh. While I was not here, not doing a show, I guess it happened on Thursday, happened late Thursday, maybe Friday. I don't know. It doesn't matter. Boy, was I Speaking of intimidation and jury intimidation, boy, was I thrilled to see that the feds had finally closed in on the SOB who was threatening the jury in the Bowers trial here, the mass murderer. And he was the one that I read you the email I had gotten from him about how he was going after if the jury did not, if the jury were going to convict him, he was going to make sure that, I don't know, it was a threat. He was going to put their names and their addresses out there. And in fact, he has, and I've since looked at it, he had compiled a list of people, many of them Jews, who he put all of their information out there, their phone numbers, their where they worked, pictures, and he gets all that from, you know, like Facebook and stuff that people post. Another reason not to get involved in any of that crapola. And he had it out there all the time. And I was scrolling through it. I didn't get to I eventually couldn't bear it anymore. I'm sure if I was one of them, somebody would have told me. But I sure saw a lot of people who I know on this SOB's list, where he had put them out there as Jews and as Jews who were anti-white, pretty much any Jew to him. So anyway, he's, thank God, back in jail, as he should be. His name is Hardy Lloyd. And he has spent most of his life in and out of jail. And the minute he gets out, he just starts right up again. I wondered why they weren't getting him, why they weren't arresting him, because I knew they were watching him. So they watch and watch and watch. They knew he was leafleting all over the East End up until the time they finally arrested him. So, God. I think he's going to do some serious time now. Let's hope. You know, you never thought this kind of thing would happen in America. You didn't. But we now know that obviously it sure as heck can. Speaking of America, so much wonderful stuff here, so many wonderful people. And yet, we are ill-governed, I think, mostly because of our just uncritical embrace of capitalism. I really think that's if you try to figure out what went wrong in almost any case, in healthcare, at the universities, all you got to look at is sort of the corporatization of everything in this country. And the corporatization playing by the ugly rules of rapacious American capitalism, where winning is everything. And there was an article some time ago that I saw sort of recounting all of the ways in which we Americans are so much more at risk than people living in other wealthy nations. We're at risk in so many ways because we refuse to do the kinds of things that other wealthy, and I would argue more civilized nations do. We refuse. Universal health care. We refuse. And so this is like nothing that you don't know, but this guy, David Wallace Wells, sort of put it all out there. Life expectancy in the United States, you know where we stand? Where, if in all the countries, we're below Sri Lanka. Life expectancy. We're below Albania, Kosovo, Algeria. They have, Sri Lankans, Algerians have a higher life expectancy than the United States. And normally you would believe that the world's wealthiest country would have one of the perks of being born into the world's wealthiest country should be that you're going to have a higher quality of life. And higher quality would also mean longer. Well, it ain't true. Anywhere near true. Now, it is true for the rich in America. It is true for the rich. So people who actually watch this stuff and tabulate things like what they call needless death. A needless death is like the poor 98-year-old woman in Marion. That was a needless death, also caused by a particular kind of thing happening in America today. The intimidation and thugocracy of Republican politics. Before the pandemic, roughly 500,000 more people in America died every year than would have died if they had lived in Europe. Any country, pick a country, any country. 500,000, 500,000 people, if they had not had the misfortune of living in this country, but rather were living in Europe and other countries. I'm saying Europe just because it gives you a sense of how many countries I'm talking about. 500,000, just by virtue of the fate of being born into this cruel, and I think that this cruel, selfish, crazed capitalist country. Half a million in each of the first 2 years of the pandemic. That number went up to over 1 million. Each of those years. Needless deaths would not have died but for being in this country. So over the past few years, we've seen a lot of, people trying to make sense of this dying off of the people living in this exceptional country, in this wealthy, wondrous nation. And we heard about deaths of despair, right? That was when they were trying to figure out why so many middle-aged white men were dying before their time. And they couldn't really come up with anything much, so they moved. Deaths of despair, losing status, losing jobs that they used to be able to have, the loss of all the manufacturing jobs, the loss of a certain measure of respect, the loss of power perceived, the loss, all this stuff, despair, bring in the drugs, bring in the lack of access to health care. And you end up with this, again, more needless deaths, the deaths of despair. Then, of course, throw in guns. Throw in the outrageous maternal mortality rate in this country. And that brings us back to health care in this country. And more of our children die than in any comparable country. And the fact that we will not, you can't say this. I mean, no politician wants to talk about it. No one wants to hear it. It's something that people don't want to hear. And if I talk about it, I'm told I'm depressing. Guys who actually study this stuff say all of this is really relatively recent phenomenon. So this was not the way America ranked when I was a child. We were at the top of the heap. So this is something we've done to ourselves. And those who study it think it really started up big time in the mid-'80s. Seems like that's when Republicans were running things. And then just grew and grew and grew. According to life expectancy research that the University of Southern California has been doing, among 18 high-income countries, the United States has fallen from the middle. We'd already dropped to the middle of the pack in 1980. Middle of the pack to dead last. 18 high-income countries, we're last. By just the year 2000, these researchers discovered that about 400,000 Americans were dying each year, above the number projected by peer countries' mortality rates. In other words, any of the other wealthy nations would predicting how many of their country people would be dead that year. They would never, ever have assumed that 400,000 Americans, above and beyond what they would have said, would die. And then it turns out that by 2010, that was an extra 500,000 deaths in the United States. And in 2019, it was 622,000 deaths. That's the last year that they've done the numbers and the math. So it just keeps growing. Need less deaths. And then if you just look at other things. How do people die? Car crash. Right? The rate of death in car crash 4 times higher in the United States than in Germany. And in other categories of violent death, the gaps are even larger. More than 2021, more than 5,000 Americans died in workplace accidents, compared with 123 in England. Americans are nearly twice as likely to die in fires than people living in Europe. Twice as likely. More than twice as likely to drown. What the hell? I'm sorry, I'm laughing. I'm not I'm laughing just out of... We're twice as likely as the French to have diabetes, twice as likely to be obese as, a million other countries. Our mortality rate is, women dying in childbirth is more than 3 times as high. And then just make that even higher for Black American women, because they die in childbirth at more than twice the national rate, which is already way higher than in other countries. I could go on and on. I'll stop. There's other stuff in here. It's just and of course, when you start looking at the demographics in terms of ethnicity and racial stuff, of course, it's Native Americans and Black Americans and Hispanic Americans. Dying at greater rates. So that's American exceptionalism. But we're not supposed to talk about that. Oh, Russ is arguing that the fires after the San Francisco earthquake in 1906 took over 3,000 lives. I guess the problem there is, do they know the fire took 3,000? It was just fire, or the earth? I wonder how they tabulate that, because the Peshtigo fire and the Maui fire are just fires. There is not that other death-causing issue that mucks up the... So I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. What's the entire death toll in the San Francisco quake, fire and quake? Do we know? Look, all I know, Russ, is I'm going by the people who write these things, and I assume they have to do some serious homework. When so toll of San Francisco fire. Quake. San Francisco quake. What do we get? More than 3,000. The quake and resulting fire. One of the worst natural disasters, over 3,000. So they're saying that is the number for the quake and the fire. I guess you can't really sort that out. But when it comes to national mass murder events, with natural causes, you do have, obviously, San Francisco earthquake. You've got the Peshtigo fire. Unfortunately, we're going to have the Maui fire. You have the Johnstown flood. What other horrors do we have? Wasn't there some ship that blew up in a northeastern port at some point that just killed a whole bunch of folks? I don't know. Surely somebody has written a book about these massive death events. And of course, 9/11 was one of the biggies. But I don't know. Hey, I am so curious about this. I have to tell you, you've heard that the former NFL football player whose supposed life story was told in that movie, The Blind Side. He played, I think, mostly for Baltimore, didn't he? Michael Orr. Did you see the movie? I know when I saw the movie, I was very uncomfortable with it. There was something. Anyway, I'm not surprised. I was uncomfortable because he was portrayed as this big, hulking dumbbell. And then there was this wonderful, beyond belief white family who took him in and then, got him to the NFL. And I just always, I really didn't like that movie. And now he is saying that family that supposedly adopted him, he's saying they never really adopted him. And I don't know about it. It says it essentially stole his life story from him, and that they had negotiated a contract with 20th Century Fox for $225,000 and 2.5% of future proceeds for themselves and their biological children, based on his life. And it specifically was their biological children who were going to get a cut of it. He got $14,000. What the hell? The movie has generated more than $300 million in revenue worldwide. And he says they got him into some kind of conservatorship where he relinquished his ability to enter into contracts. And this was done when he was, young, when he was in high school. He has now asked a Tennessee court to formally end any legal relationship he has with this family who exploited him. And he claims they never legally adopted him, which is mind-blowing, and that he had been tricked into signing away his decision-making powers so the family could make millions off of him. I don't know. And the other thing that I know he has said, he did not like that movie. And I don't blame him, because he was portrayed as, well, he says it. He says the movie portrayed him as less intelligent than he was. I mean, in fact, in college, he got good grades. And they depicted him like he was some kind of an idiot. And he says it influenced, obviously, how others perceived him, even other in his life. And here's what he says. People look at me and they take things away from me because of a movie. They don't really see the skills, the kind of player I am. That's why I get downgraded so much, because of something off because of that movie. He thinks the movie really, he had a very successful career, but I think he feels that that movie, in some respects, almost defamed him. And it certainly enriched this Tui family, or whatever, however you pronounce it. Awful. Anyway, I find that a very interesting story, and I will be following closely to see if, in fact, he gets what he wants. At least an acknowledgement that he was exploited like that. Whatever. Anyway, I guess that's it. I'm done. And I'll talk to you tomorrow, okay?
Lynn Cullen Live, Monday through Thursday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. and archived at pghcitypaper.com. The opinions expressed on Lynn Cullen Live are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the viewpoints of Pittsburgh City Paper or its advertisers.